Hey guys, if you're in my class, we have talked about the causes of the First World War, and we've talked about the ways in which it was conducted in terms of technology and strategy. And today we're going to talk about how the war ended, both militarily and with the Treaty of Versailles. So as you're watching the video, make sure you're able to identify the turning points that led to the end of the war, the important events that led to the war coming to a close, and describe the Treaty of Versailles, what it said, what it required each side to do, and what some of its failings and shortcomings were as well. We'll talk about how the Treaty of Versailles was actually a very flawed document that in some ways did more harm than good, and you should be able to explain the gist of that. Also be able to identify or define these terms: armistice, Big Four, that's the Big Four leaders at the Treaty of Versailles Conference, the 14 points, the war guilt clause in the Treaty of Versailles, reparations, and mandates. So, as you can imagine, as we've been talking about all of the horrible aspects of World War I, morale was grinding down very, very low as the war continued to drag on. Russia, things get so bad in Russia, they end up having a large-scale revolution against their government, against the Tsar, starting in 1917, and they end up leaving the war in early 1918 as a result of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So Russia is out of the war. They were one of the main Allied powers, and they're gone. And this is originally very, very good for Germany, because with Russia gone, they don't have an enemy on their east to worry about. So they can focus all of their energies on the Western Front. Now, as you can imagine, this is going to make the Allied powers like France and Great Britain very nervous. But to the rescue come the Americans, who officially entered the war in 1917 and started arriving in fairly large numbers towards the beginning of 1918 on the Western Front. America had tried its best to stay neutral. They did not necessarily want to get involved in the war. Most people in America sympathized with the Allies. You think about it, most people in America speak English and are of English ancestry at the time, so they're going to sympathize with England. There were some people in America, like German immigrants, who sympathized with the Central Powers. Also, Irish Americans sympathized with Germany because Ireland historically hates England, but America largely sympathetic to the Allies. Some things that drove the Americans into the war would be the U-boat attacks on ships that were carrying Americans, most famously the Lusitania being sunk in May of 1915 with 128 Americans aboard, and a telegram that was intercepted by the British and given over to the Americans that showed that the Germans were trying to get Mexico to attack the United States in 1917. And that was really the straw that broke the camel's back and led to America entering the war. Now, America did send soldiers over, as you can see this guy here on the right of this slide, but it wasn't the manpower that was the big contribution. It was the finances and the supplies that really turned the tide and made the difference on the Western Front and helped the Allies push through to a ultimate victory in the war. As 1918 wore on, the Germans were running low on supplies. Morale continued to dip, and finally in the fall of 1918, the Germans, their generals informed the leadership of the country they really didn't think they could win the war. So they arranged an armistice, or an end to the fighting, and it was signed at 11 a.m. local time in France on November 11th, 1918. That's the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And that's not a coincidence. They signed it then as a very, very memorable time and date. This was thought to be the worst war ever, and they thought it would be the war to end all wars. So the time the armistice was signed was supposed to be this very memorable, momentous occasion. So, after the war ends, the treaty has to be signed, the peace has to be arranged. So all of the leaders of the victorious Allied countries descend on the Palace of Versailles, which had been built back in the day by Louis XIV. It's near Paris. The Big Four are the leaders of the main Allied nations during World War I. They are President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, George Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Vittorio Orlando, who was the Premier of Italy. Woodrow Wilson had a plan called the 14 Points that he had put together before the war was even over. And the 14 Points was his plan or his vision for a world peace that would last throughout the ages. And it included measures like freedom of the seas, so that countries could travel on the seas without having to worry about, say, submarine attacks. It included open and honest diplomacy, because remember, these secret alliances like the Triple Alliance and Triple Entente, those are the kinds of things that got us into this mess in the first place. So Wilson said those should be done away with. He did call for Alsace and Lorraine to be returned to France because it was rightfully theirs. And he called for the development of an organization that would mediate disputes between countries, and that would eventually be created and be known as the League of Nations. But Wilson is different from the other Big Four leaders. Wilson has this kind of high, majestic idea of creating this lasting world peace. But what the other Big Four leaders wanted to do was put the screws to Germany, because they had endured very heavy losses and financial strain throughout the war, and basically wanted to get Germany back for all of that damage. So the Germans didn't really actually have a say-so in what the treaty said, but the Germans were forced to sign it anyway. And the picture you see there is of the German delegation signing the treaty in 1919. In the treaty, Germany's military was very, very sharply reduced. They were allowed to have no more than 100,000 men in their army, whereas they had many, many more before that. They were also not allowed to develop an air force. The war guilt clause of the treaty said that Germany and its allies were solely responsible for starting the whole war and for how bad it got. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, is that actually true? And the answer would be no. You have to remember that Germany didn't actually start the war. Germany would argue that Serbia started the war when its nationalist group killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But history is written by the victors, as they say, so Germany is assigned all of the blame, which is going to lead to a lot of anger and bitterness among not only the German leaders, but the German people at large. Germany's government was also forced to pay a whole bunch of money to the Allied governments for all the damage they caused, and that was called reparations. Reparations at that time were in the amount of 269 billion, with a B, marks, which is the German currency. That was the equivalent of 100,000 metric tons of gold, or in 2013 money, $824 billion, which is a cartoonishly large sum of money, especially since Germany had undergone just as much financial ruin as a result of the war, so having to pay almost $1 trillion in 2013 money on top of that was just going to make things worse. So, as you can see here, the Treaty of Versailles does not go the way that Woodrow Wilson wanted it to go. He wanted it to be a document that would ensure world peace for the long term, as he would say, to make the world safe for democracy. Whereas it ends up becoming a document just riddled with hate and revenge and bitterness and punishment. And it's going to be an indirect cause of World War II down the road. Germany is not going to forget that this happened to them. Plenty is wrong with the Treaty of Versailles. There are other areas in which it failed besides what happened to Germany. The colonies get absolutely no love as a result of World War I. The Allied powers and the Central powers alike drew on their colonies for resources and for manpower during the war. So after the war was over, a lot of those colonies were very hopeful that they would get greater freedom or maybe even independence as a measure of thanks for what they contributed. But that does not end up happening. Countries like India, for example, a British colony, don't gain independence until after World War II. The colonies that had been controlled by Germany and the Ottoman Empire before the war just get taken over by the Allies. The areas in the Middle East, like Iraq and Jordan and Syria, that had been controlled by the Ottoman Empire, you see there, are taken over, as well as the German colonies in Africa and in the South Pacific. And they were called mandates. the idea was that the Allied countries had a mandate or the authority to rule over these places. And it was on paper proposed as, we'll just help you out until you're powerful enough to control yourself, and then you'll become independent. But essentially, Iraq and Syria and Jordan and all of those places in Africa just ended up becoming Allied colonies instead of being Central Powers colonies. So you might be able to imagine that's going to lead to a lot of anger among those people, and it's going to sow the seeds and fan the flames of nationalism and patriotism in those areas on down the road. And as you know, since there is a Second World War, this peace that the Treaty of Versailles allegedly creates doesn't end up lasting. The League of Nations, which Wilson proposed, did end up forming. But, ironically, the U.S. never joined it because the U.S. Senate never ratified the Treaty of Versailles. So without the United States, the world's most powerful country by this time, as a member, the League of Nations was a completely impotent body. It was utterly powerless, and it couldn't do anything. So when Germany, under Adolf Hitler, starts to remilitarize in the 1930s, the League of Nations can't do a thing about it. And that's going to sow the seeds of a second global conflict fought in the same area over a bunch of the same land. That'll do it for today. Make sure you watch this video in advance of your test, and as always, ask your teacher if you have any questions. Cheers!